So I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Saturday, February 15th, 2020. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We kind of break the rules here for Native Radio. We don't do buffalo speeches and we don't do prayers. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity, and we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us, and we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind people that our audio streams at our website, www.letstalknative.com. We stream live video of the show on our Facebook group page via Facebook Live. We take the audio and we put it up on SoundCloud, which puts it up as a podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms. We take the video and we put it up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. So you can follow us on Instagram, you can follow us on Twitter, and of course you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and to our podcasts. I am the host of Let's Talk Native, and I'm joined here in studio by Jake Proud, who is managing our video and our sound. All right, let me get right into it. Free, prior, and informed consent. What the hell does that mean? Well, it's to put it simply, it is veto power. If you're saying that in order for a number of things, and let me be clear, free, prior, and informed consent is mentioned a half dozen times in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying I'm a huge fan of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I'm not saying that this thing is, somehow our savior. It sure isn't. In fact, it is the minimum standard that the international community could agree upon. It's the minimum standard. This isn't, giving us something. This is like saying the rock bottom minimum standard that Indigenous people need for survival, for their integrity, and for any kind of well-being is what this includes. 6 times the expression free, prior, and informed consent is mentioned in this. So it's not just snuck in there. This isn't just something that somebody got away with putting in there that nobody noticed. It was probably one of the more debated lines, and again, it shows up in 6 different articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But again, this is the minimum standard. This is not, this is not like propping us up. This is saying this is the minimum standard that a people who predate the settler colonialism that now, has tried to assert control over peoples and lands, and it's saying the minimum. So free, prior, and informed consent. What that means is that in order for in the 6th place, according to this, and I'm not saying it should be limited to this, but according to this, things like land use, removing people, depriving people of access to land, trying to come up with any kind of just compensation for egregious acts. Again, 6 times. You look it up yourself and you can read it. It's not a great read, but there's a few things that I pull out of this every once in a while, just because it is an acknowledgement that the international community, the United Nations, and all the member states, well, except for the 4 who voted against it in 2007, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Those are the 4 who voted against it. But since then, they all claim that, oh, yeah, we're okay with it now. In fact, at the end of last year, not only did you have guys like Justin Trudeau saying, oh, yeah, we're going to fully adopt the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, whatever that means. But in BC, of all places, in British Columbia, they actually passed legislation at the end of last year that embeds the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into their legal framework. So what does that mean? Well, it means very little, because now they're trying to jam a pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory. And in fact, the debate seems to rage on what does free, prior, and informed consent mean. I mean, what did Trudeau said, a couple of years ago? He said, Ottawa doesn't recognize the unconditional right of First Nations to unilaterally block projects. And in fact, the minister from British Columbia says, well, veto doesn't show up any place in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The word veto isn't in there. Of course it's not in there. But it says the requirement to do some of the crap that you're trying to do to Native people is that you have to have their free, prior, and informed consent. So if I got to break it down, I'll break it down. It means that they have to freely consent to something. And they have to be fully informed to what they're consenting to. And it doesn't say that they need consultation or to be notified. It says, no, you need consent from them. So for all intents and purposes, free, prior, and informed consent does mean that Native people, the international community is recognizing that Native people do have say on these projects, on anything that affects, and not even just a pipeline going through the territory. I mean, this involves, like the Dakota Access Pipeline, the idea that their lands could be affected because something was going to happen upstream of their territory. I mean, that's what's included here. So you've got the United States and Canada saying, well, after Harper and after the Bush years, you've got Obama and you've got Trudeau saying, yeah, we support the aspirations of the agreement as long as it doesn't violate our laws. Well, that's the problem, though. So here's this document that gets out there, and of course, the U.S., Canada, and Australia, New Zealand, they're all like under the gun because they're the only countries that voted against it. And why? Because they have indigenous populations. That's why. The other countries do, but not in they don't have the same shame and guilt associated. They weren't as guilty of mass genocide. In fact, many of the countries, have gained independence from their colonial lords, kind of. Except for the fact that you've still got, white people, white Europeans that are the dominant political strength in places like Brazil and Bolivia and Venezuela and stuff like that. So, yeah. But anyway, so here you have it. You have this language. You have the province that surrounds Wet'suwet'en territory claiming just at the end of last year. And this debate in Wet'suwet'en territory has been going on for a while here. And they still pass this thing. And then immediately the minister from BC says, oh, no, it doesn't say veto anywhere. They don't have veto power. We're recognizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but they don't have veto power. And then, of course, Trudeau, again, he doesn't even talk about Indigenous people, which I'm not crazy about the words either, but he's got to always throw that First Nations expression in there. Ottawa doesn't recognize the unconditional rights of First Nations to unilaterally block projects. Well, what is a First Nation? And we can get into that debate. And I'll tell you what, the better debate is consent from who? I mean, I talked about it in the last show. I listened to one of these guys on a CBC interview, hereditary chief from Wet'suwet'en territory, and he was referring to the courts as his courts. He was referring to himself as a British Columbian, as a Canadian, and this guy's supposed to be traditional. So wait a second. So an indigenous distinct people aren't the ones who are going to be called upon for this consent? Just a Canadian is going to be called? I mean, a Canadian of color? And of course, if you look at the whole FedRec process, both on the U.S. and the Canadian side, whether you're talking about tribal councils, band councils, or even these so-called traditional councils, you have people who are oftentimes in the pocket, and especially on the Canadian side, because the Indian Act, and my good friend Degarundage, if you haven't seen the video of him giving an interview in Ganawage, I posted it on the Let's Talk Native page, but it's making it around. He's got like almost 200,000 views of this thing. So his words are getting out there far better than mine are. But he makes the point. If you've accepted the Indian Act, then you're in their ship. You're not in, and this is what I talked about in the last show. You're not in our canoe. You're in their ship. You're recognizing, you are acknowledging the whole idea of the assimilation. And you're saying you're a Canadian, which is exactly what this Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief said. If you're a Canadian, then you can't speak for the people of Wet'suwet'en. I mean, it just defies logic. And of course, I'm always going to get into a debate, even with my good friend Martha Fasthorst just on Facebook today. She's calling on Native people to go out and vote. I mean, you show me one place. You show me one place that the Native vote, even if we were just voted as a block, which we wouldn't, that the Native vote would turn a red state blue. Show me one state that the Native vote would turn a red state blue, or the other way around for that matter. And here's the thing, because of the influence of church, military service, and and more, there's a good chance that many Native territories might lean right. They might lean blue, or lean red and right, not blue and left. So be careful what you wish for. If you think you're trying to get the Native vote out because you're going to unseat Trump, white people are going to vote for him, or not vote for him. We're not going to make the difference there. What do we do when we participate in these systems? We just sell out. We just become assimilated. I always post the meme of the meme that I created with the sticker that says, here's the sticker if you're Native and you vote in the elections. I just contributed to the systems of oppression. No, that's what it is. And so, again, I go back to the original question: free, prior, and informed consent from who? So, does Canada get to decide who gives them the consent? Or do the Native people, do the Wet'suwet'en get to decide? And if so, then you better decide wisely. Because if the guys that you're calling your hereditary chiefs view themselves as Canadians, as British Columbians, as little more than just a traditional version of a band council, operating under the Indian Act, viewing the courts as yours, then you better be careful who you're standing up to say has the power or the authority to give that consent, because that's a bit of a problem, folks. That's a bit of a problem. Because I'm not saying how any given territory should determine what constitutes consent, but I'll tell you one thing: you can't have consent if the people don't know what's going on. So if you only talk to a few Native guys, I don't care if they're in traditional, clothing or not, or if they're in a three-piece suit and just darker skin. You pull them in the room and you tell them, well, here's what we're going to do, and here's what we're going to pay you. If the rest of the people don't know, that's not free, prior, and informed consent. That's collusion. That's coercion. That's paying off a few individuals. So as much as, look, I appreciate the language, free, prior, and informed consent. But if the United States and Canada can decide who has the power to give that consent, that we, the people, don't have that power? And what does that mean exactly? Look, a lot of this gets difficult. And even even when, Trudeau says unilateral, well, as opposed to unilateral, who are you saying is going to sit at the table? Justin Trudeau, are you going to sit at the table? I see this video going around with my friend Seth trying to talk to a Indigenous Affairs minister about polishing the covenant chain. Well, who the hell is that guy? I'm not talking about Seth. I'm talking about who's this low-level minister of Indigenous Affairs to represent. Is he really going to be there with the authority to represent the crown? Really? Or is he just some little, diplomatic shill? And of course, I'm not even sure who Seth's representing either. He's raising some good questions, and I don't have a problem with that. But who's he raising the question to? So, yeah, I got to ask the question, well, who representing us or any Native territory represents that free, prior, and informed consent, and to whom? Because by the time you communicate some opinion to a low-level, diplomat or appointed official on the U.S. or Canadian side, by the time that gets translated over and over a few times, they've got us saying, they're putting all kinds of words in our mouths. So, diplomacy is the idea that people who have who are legitimately carrying the voice, and it's a slow process from a Native standpoint. It's a slow process for us to actually accomplish these diplomatic missions. Why? Because we've got to go back to our people all the time. I mean, according to our culture. Of course, if you're a band council, chief, if you're a First Nations chief, or a Fed Rec, president, chief, tribal chairman, whatever other labels that the federal government's willing to recognize as leadership, then they're all for giving you all kinds of authority. They don't care what your system is, and if you are legitimately wielding that authority, they just want somebody who can sign the paper. That's all they want. They want somebody who can put an X on it. You don't have to sign it. You can look back at all the old treaties. No, you don't need to sign anything. Just put an X here. We just need a mark on a paper, knowing that you gave something up. And that's the absurdity of it. And then once that mark gets put on the paper, then they start twisting all of those words around. I hear this one all the time. Not only do people want to misrepresent what they call the George Washington belt, which is bullshit, a bullshit wampum belt. It's not even ours. Oneida's made it under as a commissioned piece for George Washington asked for that to be made. So it wasn't made for us. It didn't represent our account of a negotiation or an agreement or an understanding. None of that stuff. It's a very submissive. If you don't know what it looks like, look it up. George Washington belt. It's terrible. It shows us as these two little guys around 13 big men, and they're holding something over our heads. And I've heard Native people, I've heard Oren Lyons, and I've heard some of these people, these iconic voices out there saying, this is symbolizes us being under the U.S. protection. I'm thinking, bullshit. Where did that come from? And I just recently saw a treaty where the United States does use the word protection, but they're talking about protecting us from them and their tax system. They're saying that they're making a commitment in one of these treaties to protect us from states trying to impose taxes. So they're essentially saying they're protecting us from them, not that they've placed us under their protection against some sort of outside foe. No, they're just, so it's not, we aren't placed under their protection. This isn't about subordinance or submission. So even when that word gets used, and this is how people twist this stuff around. Free, prior, and informed consent does mean veto power. It doesn't mean that we have one guy who has that power. It means that we as people have the power to approve or not approve, to consent or not consent to a pipeline going through our territories. And in fact, no individual in most of our territories, and I can't speak to all. I mean, look, maybe some places, I hear words like matriarch being used. That's not even in our system. We have things like matrilineal systems, but matriarchs is no different than that's like the queen. The queen's a matriarch. So you have queens in our territories, and yet we have people using that word. Oh yeah, the matriarchs of a territory got arrested. Look, we don't have matriarchal. We don't have women who are placed in supreme positions of power over our territory, or men. But I don't. Maybe you do. If you do, you do. And if you live in a community where you've bestowed that level of authority on a few individuals, and look, metaphorically, if you're referring to somebody as a matriarch, just because they are a strong woman who stands up for the people, okay, I get that. The problem is, by the time the media gets a hold of it and they start using that word, it takes on a different meaning. And it's an English word. It's not ours. This isn't our language. So when we use things like, even the word chief, I think that's a Scottish or Irish word. It's a European word. Our words don't even translate to something like that. So if we say Rudionesu or Rayana, we aren't talking about somebody who's been placed above everybody else. In fact, specifically in our culture, we say no, all the heads are the same. Our heads are at the same level. We don't have hierarchies in our territory. We don't have archies. We don't have monarchies. We don't have patriarchies. We don't have rulers. We have servants. When somebody is placed in one of these positions, they are servants of the people. So a servant of the people couldn't give that consent. Somehow you have to determine, well, how are you accurately going to communicate the will of the people? Well, first off, you've got to inform them. In order for free, prior, and informed consent to come from people, the people have to know what's going on. You can't have a few people in a closed door session saying, well, they offered us X millions of dollars and, maybe access to something. I mean, or jobs. Yeah, you got to hear this one. Oh, yeah, they're going to put a pipeline through it and we're going to get jobs. What, for 6 months? I mean, these are permanent jobs. So, and then they're going to set up man camps and they're going to do all, I mean, there's a direct connection between the extractive industries, the pipeline industries, all that stuff, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so when these guys, come into a territory, they want to grab a brown guy and say, hey, do you have authority to sign off on something? Can you give consent? And let me tell you what we're going to do. They won't discuss the impacts, the negative impacts of this stuff. No, we're just going to talk about here's what we're going to do for you. We're going to talk about here's what we're going to do for you. So, no, free, prior, and informed consent. It's mentioned 6 times. 6 times in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And at the end of last year, like I said, BC claims to have incorporated. They actually put the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into their legal framework. So, unlike in the United States, where if you tried to cite a violation of the UN Declaration, the courts would just say, we're not bound by that. In BC, they're supposed to be. In fact, Harper, the prime minister, claims that he was going to honor and follow and incorporate the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People into Canadian law. He didn't, but BC claims to be doing it. And yet BC is where all the pressure is mounting against the Wet'suwet'en. Now I'm not saying the Wet'suwet'en are British Columbians. Apparently one of your hereditary chiefs said that, but I'm not saying that. You guys can decide that for yourselves, but I'm not saying you're Canadians. I'm not saying Wet'suwet'en territory is part of Canada or part of BC. I'll sit here and tell you right now, I don't consider Cattaraugus part of New York State or Allegheny or the territories that the Senecas have acquired under their land acquisition clause of the Salamanca Settlement Act. No, that's absolute title. That's land that the Senecas own outright. They have original and absolute title to the land. So they don't hold this land with a New York State deed or even a U.S. title. How do I know this? Well, because the words that they put in their treaty, not the ones that people want to claim is demonstrated in the George Washington Belt, but in the Canada-Davis Treaty, they said the United States recognizes that the Seneca land is theirs, that the land is theirs, it belongs to the Senecas, and the United States will never claim the same. And in fact, they said it about all 6 nations, that our land was ours and the United States would never claim the same, nor interfere with our free use and enjoyment of that land. Of course, just like Canada, ignores those, that original language or the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The U.S. does too. They still do whatever the hell they feel like. They violate international. Is it a law? Does a declaration constitute a law? It should. But the United States will say, no, we're not bound by that. But Canada, that's a little different thing on the Canadian side, especially if BC claims to have embedded this in their legal framework. It starts to become a problem for them. And then they got to get into a debate. Well, does free, prior, and informed consent mean veto power? And so when you hear the BC minister, in the same breath as putting this into their law, turn around and say, well, the words veto don't show up anyplace in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's a lot that doesn't show up on this, but it's clear. A couple of things are clear in this document. This is a repudiation of the doctrine of Christian discovery. Third affirmation of look it up. The third affirmation in the preamble of this thing. It's a clear repudiation of the racist policies associated, all racist policies, but clearly the doctrine of Christian discovery. And the other thing that's clear is they're saying you just can't do stuff to Native people without their consent, without free, prior, and informed consent. And it says people, not just their leaders. It doesn't say First Nations. It doesn't say band councils. It doesn't say chiefs. It doesn't say patriarchs or matriarchs. It says the people. So we got a bit of a problem on our hands here, because there's language, and just like with all of this stuff, you go back through history, the contradictions are amazing. The level of contradiction and double talk. So I mean, you got Justin Trudeau saying, "Well, no, they don't have unilateral right to block projects." Well, what does free, prior, and informed consent mean then? I mean, it says you have to consent. You have to get consent. That is unilateral authority. That is veto power. All right, hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break and we'll come back, and I'll get yelling at the microphone again in just a few minutes. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Hey, I want to thank our sponsors. Let's Talk Native is sponsored by Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and the good folks at Grand River Enterprises and Native Wholesale Supply. That's it. We don't have a whole lot. I know a couple people have expressed an interest recently, and I'm hoping we add a few more sponsors. The more we have, the more we can do. I mean, the more sponsorship we have, the more resources we have, the more we can do. Jake and I have been, trying to bang out some videos along the way. We'd like to do a full-length documentary. In fact, we're trying to put together, at least an equipment budget for some of that stuff. So we're always trying to do something a little bit more than what we're doing. But again, I'm grateful for those of you who do sponsor on a regular basis, and those of you who do it sometimes just out of the blue. Whether you make a PayPal donation you find our PayPal link off of our website, letstalknative.com, or whether you purchase one of our shirts. One of our Let's Talk Native shirts, or the shirt I'll be rocking next week, my Abraham Lincoln with the noose. Yes, Abraham Lincoln, the executioner. I'll be rocking that shirt. Jake will flash a few of them up there on the screen as at some point, at least on the YouTube video, you'll see it. But go to our website and then go to the store. Go to letstalknative.com. Go to the store, and you'll see we've got a bunch of shirts up there that Jake has put his artistic mind to work here to create, and the Lincoln one is that's among the first ones that I've ordered. So I look forward to wearing that, and so people can see it. And I posted a picture of it the other day, so I know people have responded. So that's another way you can support the show. That way you can actually you can wear something a little controversial. There's nothing controversial about Let's Talk Native, by the way, but you wear one of the more cringeworthy shirts, if you will, that could start a conversation, and you support the show at the same time. But look, I'm also really grateful for those of you who share the shows, and not only just watching it, but those of you who share the shows, especially whether you share the Facebook live stream or the podcast or the YouTube videos, however you get it out. I appreciate you guys spreading the word. Some of the conversations that I'm having, I know. Look, I realize it's uncomfortable sometimes. I realize that I am calling some of our people out, and I'm willing to take the grief for that, because some people say, "Why are you always calling our own people down?" Well, because sometimes our own people are wrong. That's why I do it. I mean, and I think we have to be responsible. We can't hold others responsible if we're not responsible. I mean, how do we push back against Canada if you turn around behind you and you got everybody calling themselves Canadians? If the people that if your own family are Trump supporters or Justin Trudeau supporters, I don't know how that's not building a strong coalition, and that's not asserting the kind of resistance. I mean, and I see people on both the U.S. and the Canadian side that buy in. And look, you're going to see more Canadian flags and U.S. flags flying on Native territories, than you're going to see any of our individual iconic images, and that's a problem. So Anyway, I want to thank all of you who do share the show. I think it is important. I think it's really important that we have this conversation and that we take on the tough conversations. I mean, some of the stuff it is important. It's the last show I talked about. I talked about the things that we can do, and there is a lot that we can do. And if you think by not joining in that system that the alternative is to do nothing, man, that's a terrible way of viewing it. No, we need to resist. And I'm not saying we got to go out and fight people all the time, but we need to educate. We need to stand our ground. Look, the amount of rail that's being blocked on the Canadian side in support of the Wet'suwet'en territories, it's incredible. I mean, it really is incredible. It's hard sometimes to get people on the U.S. side to do that. We don't seem to stand together on the same way here. But it's also easy to all of a sudden the message doesn't lose. You lose the messaging, so to speak. Look, Idle No More. I thought that was a great movement. I mean, and the beauty of Idle No More was that it was grassroots, completely grassroots. Then all of a sudden you get somebody like Teresa Spence out there who gains all of the attention because of her so-called hunger strike. And so what happens is you take the wind out of the sails of a movement. What's happening in Wet'suwet'en territory is happening in many of our territories, U.S. and the Canadian side of the imaginary line. And in fact, across an ocean into Hawaii. This is the same kind of things that we are facing in many of our territories, in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Australia. These are the same kind of things that Indigenous people are facing all over. So, how do we resist? And I'm sorry, if you think you got to join them and somehow fix it from the inside, like I said, there is no place in the United States that even if you get every Native person in a Native community to vote for Democrats, which is problematic all by itself, are you going to turn Oklahoma blue? I don't think so. North Dakota? Idaho? Come on. I mean, you show me a significant swing state that the Native vote, if we came out in big numbers and voted as a block, that we could change it. Show me that. Just show me that. And then I'll give you at least something to your argument. The problem is, in order to do that, in order for us to vote, we've got to throw away, we got to turn our back on our ancestors. We got to say, you know what? We are, we're not Native anymore. We're not Ungwe. Now we're Americans. Now we're Canadians. And man, that should bother us at many different levels. And I'll tell you where it should really bother us. If we're ever going to hold up this notion of free, prior, and informed consent, are we really representing the Indigenous people, the people who are not just descendants of those people who predate the settler colonials on our lands now? If we're not those people anymore, and I'm sorry, just like Degarunduke said, and said in his video, by all means. Like I said, that video of him doing this interview, I think it's got to be close to 200,000 views now. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. I posted it on the Let's Talk Native Facebook group page, and so you can find it. Just scroll down a little bit, and you'll find it down there. And it's not a very long video. It may only be about 10 minutes long, but again, but he makes the point. He makes the same thing we talk about here all the time. We better understand this identity issue. Because if you are accepting U.S. citizenship, if you are accepting Canadian citizenship, then you can't be the one that provides the consent on what happens on a Native territory. Because you represent the other side then. I mean, this isn't complicated, folks. This is pretty basic stuff. Now, look, there's no question that again, according to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's fine that you get absorbed into the state. It's fine that you do that. And they have to let you vote. They have to let you do this stuff, and they have to afford you all of the rights of their citizenry. In fact, they have to provide you with citizenship according to the U.S. Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's not a whole lot in here that talks about our sovereignty, which is where this thing falls. I mean, and falls apart as far as I'm concerned. But I'm not saying we can't pull the decent words out of there. I mean, after all, Article 43 of this thing, and I'll read it for you. Article 43. It says the rights recognized herein constitute the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world. So, right out of the gate, this is not a utopian fix. This is the minimum standard that the United States and Canada can't even come close to meeting. They don't even try. I mean, they don't even try to achieve any of this stuff. And even some of the free prior and informed consent references in here talks about after they didn't get free prior and informed consent, that they still need free prior and informed consent for redress on their on their violations. I mean, it's again, some pretty good doublespeak in there too. And I know a lot of Native people were really proud of this thing, and they worked hard and that kind of stuff. And the international community felt so gracious about making this declaration. The problem is it has no bite. It has no bite. And the moment somebody even brings it up, they got to talk out of the other side of their face and say, "Yeah, but there's no veto power there. No, the people don't have any authority. We're supposed to provide them, get free prior and informed consent, but there's no, but they still want to deny. In fact, the reason the United States voted against this thing, they wanted to redefine what self-determination means. And it's not just the United States. Canada wants, no, self-determination means internal self-determination. It means that they only get to determine, certain things within their organization. They don't want to recognize it as a nation. They'll throw the word nation out there, First Nation. But when they use sovereignty, they're going to throw things like tribal in front of it, tribal sovereignty. They don't want to recognize real sovereignty. And the problem is there's all these treaties out there. So who are the parties to the treaties anymore? I mean, in the U.S., when they make a treaty with the Lakota, and now you've got Standing Rock Sioux, you've got Cheyenne River Sioux, you've got you've got all of these federally recognized dissections of a Native people. The Haudenosaunee, you've got the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. Well, that's not the Mohawk Nation. You got the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. You got the Oneida Nation of the Thames in Ontario, and you got the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. Well, what the hell is that? So what's the Oneida Nation? And and of course you can go across. I mean, we get caught up into those same words about, well, are we a people or are we a nation? So we get screwed up even using their language, indigenous. One of the problems I have with the word indigenous is that, according to the international definition of indigenous, they aren't acknowledging that we are those people who predate them, that we're merely descendants of those people. Well, that's a problem. I have a problem with that. We have to assert, no, we are those people. We are the people who negotiated nation to nation, people to people. I mean, however you want to use the word. I mean, that we had the authority to represent on a level playing field certain things like what access we gave you, not what you gave us, but what we gave you as far as access to our lands, and where the limitations to that were. So when people ask the question, well, can a First Nation that is represented by a band council claim to be a party to a treaty with Canada or the Crown? I don't know if they can. Because if they're just merely a municipality, look, I saw this guy who wrote this document for the Seneca Nation, where he suggested that tribal governments, and again, throwing that word, tribal governments, are a part of U.S. federalism. He tried to suggest that that tribal governments are somewhere in there between states and counties as it relates to the division of you know of breaking down governance within the federal system. And you know what? That's bullshit. I mean, that's just categorically wrong. And if any of us agree to that, then we're no longer a distinct people. We are just some sort of subdivision, you know, somewhere between municipalities, counties, but certainly lower than states or provinces. That's the way they're trying to manipulate us. We're no longer the distinct people. I mean, it's funny because in Akwesasne, in fact, there was a case a few years ago where OSHA had gone into the Mohawk casino or whatever it's called, the Mohawk Nation, I don't know, Akwesasne Mohawk Casino, I guess, or whatever it's called. And they tried to cite some OSHA violations, and the St. Regis tribe of Mohawks, their council, their elected tribal council, tried to use Canandaigua Treaty. So they tried to use this treaty in their defense, and lo and behold, the U.S. government says, we don't have a treaty with the St. Regis tribe of Mohawks. You guys aren't the Mohawk Nation. We have a treaty with the Six Nations. We're not sure. You guys tried to assert some sort of Seven Nations treaty and stuff like that. So the federal government actually did what many of us warned about. We better assert who we are. We better be clear about what our identities are, because at some point it's going to come back and bite us in the ass. And if you're standing up there as a hereditary chief, claiming that you're a Canadian and that you have faith as a Canadian in your Canadian courts, be careful what you wish for. Look, I will defend myself. I mean, if I'm dragged into court in chains, and it happened, if I have to defend myself, or if I'm named in a case, I'll defend myself. But I will never seek through the U.S. court system a resolution that I'm trying to fight for. And I got to tell you, I went to Washington when, during the Obama administration, they said they wanted to rethink the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. It was like 2010. So it was during the Obama administration. He said, no, we want to clean the slate. We want to take a look at this thing, and we want to determine what where the United States should come out on this thing. And so I'm in a meeting where they've all these representatives of all the various federal agencies up on a stage, and then we're all sitting, Native people are all sitting in the audience. And when asked the question, well, why did the United States vote against this thing in 2007? And what is the concern still? Why is there still a debate? And what we were told was that the United States was concerned that this would somehow rewrite international law, and that it would undermine the current remedies that the United States has in place for dealing with Native issues. And they kept referring to this current remedies. And I'm saying, what the hell are these current remedies? And so one of the representatives, and it might have been the one from the White House, stood up and says, well, we're talking about the court system. Wait a second. So you're saying that when you violate us, that your court systems are the arbiter of justice? When it's your system that's violating us, that you guys get to name the playing field? And let's keep in mind, we're never written into your U.S. Constitution. There's no place in your court system to even recognize the sovereignty of a plaintiff or a defendant, I should say. Why? Because your court systems are only bound by the U.S. Constitution. So if we're not a part of your U.S. Constitution, you have to you can't rule on issues of native sovereignty or sovereignty, period. I mean, the only thing you can do is rule that you don't have the jurisdiction. And you never do that. Your courts never do that. I mean, if you were trying to adjudicate, a crime committed not by a member of another nation, but by another nation, you don't have the jurisdiction to, in a U.S. court, to hold China accountable, or Russia or anybody else. You can look for individuals. You're only bound by the people you have constitutional authority over. Well, you don't have constitutional authority over Native people. You never had it. You didn't include us in the beginning. And every one of your laws that you tried to pass, including the U.S. Citizenship Act, the Indian Citizenship Act, even that, we didn't consent to that. Well, there was no free, prior, and informed consent to that one. Yeah, I know. That was before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But I'll tell you what, and I've said this before, in 1924, when the United States passes the Indian Citizenship Act, that's only 5 years after, in 1919, that the international community again stepped up and said the concept of denationalization, the concept of stripping away somebody's national character and imposing another country's national character upon them is a war crime. So your Indian Citizenship Act, by that definition, was a war crime. It was an illegal act. And you know what? Native people across the United States, and even on the Canadian side, they do the same thing. Oh yeah, we didn't get a chance. We weren't granted citizenship until 1924. You weren't granted citizenship in 1924. It was imposed. There was an attempt to impose it upon you. See, we're not even having this conversation. I mean, look, I say this stuff all the time on the show, but 1,000 people are going to hear this. I need Degarundage. I need Paul Delarose to say this and get 200,000 people to hear it. Not just talk about band councils, because it's the same thing on the U.S. side. However, we got to have this conversation. We need to have this conversation, and we need to own it. And you know what? And we got to look people in the eyes who claim to be tribal counselors, tribal chairmen, chiefs, traditional chiefs, whatever this hereditary chief thing is. We don't have hereditary chiefs. For one thing, we don't have matriarchs. We don't have hereditary chiefs. We have a clan system. And anybody who says or who talks about authority, who talks about voting, somebody needs to have a whole conversation with them and say, wait, what are you saying? Are you saying that we need to assimilate? Or are you saying too late, we already did? And that we can no longer assert our distinction? Because if I have somebody tell me that, I'm writing them off. Look, by all means, step up and tell me that to my face. Because now I know that I no longer need to have a conversation with you. Because now I know that you're on that side. So now, anytime in the future that I talk to you, I know that I'm talking to a U.S. citizen or I'm talking to a Canadian. So let's be clear. Again, at the beginning of the show, I always say, look, we're going to step on a few toes along the way. And we're going to talk about identity. And this is critical. Because even if we do have some semblance of international support, where this free, prior, and informed consent thing falls apart is when we start trying to figure out, well, who has the authority to give that consent? Consent from who? It's a big problem, folks. It's a big problem. It doesn't have to be. I mean, we could sort this thing out, and we can make sure. Because here's the thing: we know, as you know, under Guyana or Lagoa, nobody has the authority to sell out our people. You know, when my buddy Ed Schiller's here in studio, and we talk about when the Seneca Nation, abandoned what they called the chief system, and it was a chief system. Why? Because it wasn't operating as a clan system anymore. So when the Seneca Nation abandoned the chief system, it was because the clan system had devolved. It had become corrupted with the mentality of male-dominant societies. And those men who sat in those positions, who claimed to carry those titles, they, again, Degarunda says all the time, no, they disqualified themselves. They didn't have to be removed. The moment they did that, they disqualified themselves. But you know what happens in Seneca Nation? They end up adopting, a 2 or 3 page constitution. And part of it was because of the corrupt nature of the individuals who claimed to be chiefs. So this isn't a brand new problem. This has been something that's been going on for 100 years. Why? Or over 100 years. Why? Because that was the whole plan. And it goes back to Washington and Jefferson and all of them. That the whole idea was to undermine who we were as a distinct people and eliminate us. Genocide isn't just about killing us. Genocide includes things like denationalization, stripping away, claiming that we're no longer the distinct people, making it, forcing us into assimilation. That's one of the articles in this thing. No more forced assimilation. And yet, the United States will say, oh, you can't travel outside of the United States unless you accept U.S. citizenship and a U.S. passport. But we won't claim that's still a war crime? We won't say that it violates the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People? We won't say that? I got into a big debate with Suzanne Harjo, another big voice out there. A lot more people listening to that woman than listening to me. But I got into a big debate because she thinks it's wrong for us to claim that we had been the victims of genocide. She thinks genocide is about race wars. And this is a woman who gives keynote speaking addresses all over the freaking United States. Look, we need to have some tough conversations. And look, and I'm not interested in beating up on anybody, not Susan Harjo or Oren Lyons or anything else. But we have to have the conversation. And if they say something, if anybody says, if I say something that needs to be called out, then call me out. I mean, let's have these tough conversations and let's try to address who we are. Because, I don't know, maybe some of you are only descendants of a people who predate the existence of the settler colonials. I mean, I don't view myself as that. I'm not a descendant of those. I am those people. So we've got to decide, are we still Unwe? Are we? Or are we U.S. citizens? Are we New Yorkers? Are we British Columbians? Are we Canadians? I mean, have we gotten rid of this whole notion that we are a distinct people? A free people? Because, like I said, some people fight for equality. And that's not a bad thing to fight for. If you're a Canadian, then by all means fight to be an equal Canadian. If you're a U.S. citizen, especially of color, by all means fight for equality under the U.S. Constitution. But that's not what we're fighting for. Because if we're equal to them, then they outnumber us and they can vote us off the island. You know what I'm saying? Our power is in our distinction, not in our numbers. We're 0.7% of the population in the United States. Maybe 2 or 3% on the Canadian side. But that's a small number, folks. Our power is in our distinction, in our identity, in the fact that we're not descendants of a people who once were. We are those people. Some people got to decide if we are those people. I'm not sure that everybody agrees with that. But that's what we have to decide. And if you're not, then step away, because there's still plenty of people. I guarantee you, across all of Turtle Island and beyond is what the Kanaka Maoli are fighting for in Hawaii. Their distinction. So if you just want to be a tribe, if you want to be federally wrecked, then step aside. Then go for it. But you're not going to speak for all of us. And you're not going to provide that free, prior, and informed consent for people to run pipelines and rape our mother. You lose that authority. All right, that's all I got. I want to thank you guys for listening. We'll do it again on Tuesday. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Thanks for listening. Hey, share the show. Pass it along. I think we need to have this conversation. You know.